If you struggle with composition in your illustrations, I have 3 simple principles that you can start using today in your work. These blast past all the academic gobbledygook about grids and golden ratios and cut right to the chase. How do I arrange things on the page and why? But first, welcome to the channel. My name is Mr. Tom Froese. I'm an illustrator and a teacher of illustration to over 106,000 students around the world. If you find this video helpful, please let me know by hitting like and even dropping me a comment. I always love hearing from you. I'm also pleased to say we recently passed 10,000 subscribers, which is a huge milestone. You know, I make these videos for you and I make them for free. And while I do get about $45 a month from ad revenue, it hardly compensates for the time I spend writing and producing these. While I don't do this for the money, every little bit of support does help. If you'd like to support what I'm doing beyond liking, subscribing, and commenting, which are all great, and that if that's all you can do, that's amazing. Do that. However, I do welcome you to join my growing community of illustrators and illustration learners on Patreon. For only $3 a month, you gain instant access to exclusive features like the patrons-only channels on Discord and monthly patrons-only live streams. Visit patreon.com/TomFroese, that's F-R-O-E-S-E, to learn more. All right, let's get into it. Composition is how things are arranged in an image. For illustrators, composition is important because it affects how we navigate the images with our eyes. For simple works with a single object or a person, composition's relatively simple. We don't need help navigating the work because there's only one thing for our eyes to see. For more complex works, such as a scene with many objects or people, the composition becomes more challenging. When combining multiple things into a single image, whether an imaginary scene or a more abstract arrangement of symbols, the question is, how do I know where to put things? Is there a right way and a wrong way? Or how do I achieve balance so that the image, no matter how complex it is, it still feels orderly? As visual creatures, we somehow sense when an image is not quite right. We can tell when a composition is off balance. Maybe it gives us an uneasy feeling like it's too heavy on one side, or maybe we simply get lost to look at an image because our eyes don't know where to enter into the piece to begin with. When we understand some principles of composition, we can better control our illustrations, knowing how to lead the eye into the piece and then lead it around it and through it. We can make more confident decisions about where to put things and not feel overly anxious that they're not in the right spot. I spent countless hours in my career, going back to my earliest days, just learning about design and illustration, moving objects around on the screen, trying to find the perfect balance. One of the worst feelings for me as an illustrator and designer has been doing this back and forth game on the screen for hours, sometimes entire days, without ever getting any closer to the perfection I imagine must be just around the corner. If I just make 1 or 2 more adjustments, maybe that perfection will finally come. It never does. So how about today? Have I found perfection? Do I now know how to balance an illustration with confidence? Or do I still waste hours and days in a futile search for the correct composition? The short answer is no. I've not found perfection, but I have found more confidence. You may have guessed it, but I've done away with the ideal of perfection. It doesn't exist. So what is my source of confidence? How can I be at peace with my compositions and know that they're working to some degree? I'm going to attempt to break it down into just 3 principles, and with these 3 principles, you can overcome most compositional challenges with at least a B+ level of satisfaction. Now, full disclosure, I am now starting to plan my next Skillshare class, which will be on this very subject, composition for illustrators. What I'm about to share with you, I haven't thought through so much that these principles are totally bulletproof, but I think they're pretty close. So here they are. The first principle is hierarchy. What is it about composition that is so hard? What's your biggest pain point where it comes to drawing up imaginary scenes or arranging visual ideas and symbols on the page? Going by the questions I get most often from students, I think this comes down to questions of what to include and where to put them, and perhaps how big. Questions like these can be resolved in terms of hierarchy. In design, Hierarchy is the various levels of information from most important to least important. By having a clear hierarchy in an image, the viewer will instinctively look at the most prominent part of the image first. That's where they'll enter in, and then naturally their eyes will move to secondary and tertiary elements of the composition. This order of visual hierarchy can be deliberate or it can be accidental. You can purposefully choose which is the most important part of the image to see first, and then which is secondary, tertiary, and so on, simply by changing things like scale, how big each element is, contrast and brightness, how dark or bright it appears against everything else, and framing, what all other elements seem to be pointing at or centered around. The larger the object, the darker, heavier, or more vibrant an object's color compared to everything else, and the way in which it is framed by everything else in the image, the more important that object will appear. So, when composing an illustration, you have to ask, what is the subject of this image? What is the main character or the main idea that needs to come through above everything else? How important are the other elements in supporting the main subject or idea? Then, you can use scale, contrast, and brightness and framing to achieve the visual hierarchy you intend. When you're struggling to figure out what's working or not in an illustration, start by knowing what one thing you need to communicate. What should that be? And then make sure that everything else in the piece is supporting that one thing and not competing against it. The second principle we're going to talk about is detail, or the level of detail. When I think about composition, it almost always comes down to hierarchy. For a moment, I considered just reducing my tips to just that one thing, hierarchy, since it's truly what all composition is about. Leading the eye into and through and sometimes out of the page in a specific order. However, I think the level of detail is also very important in making a composition that sits well with the eye. It also happens to establish some of the hierarchy within the image as well. So let me explain. Imagine you're on holidays and you've decided to hike up a mountain with a friend. When you get to the top, you have a pretty impressive view. You get your friend to snap a photo of you. When you go to post it on Instagram later on, you noticed everything about yourself right down to the scrapes on your knees and the little bit of peanut butter you should have wiped off your chin before the photo was taken. You also notice how the vista beyond looks less clear. It's somehow more faded, especially as you look further and further off into the distance. You see the lakes and forests below, and beyond you see more mountains seeming to get bluer and more faded as they get further and further toward the horizon. You see less detail because it's further from your eyes, and also there's more atmosphere between you and everything in the distance, which gives everything a more milky appearance. This is called atmospheric perspective. Now, the point I'm making here, and it's not actually a revelation, is that things in the foreground are more clear. We see more detail and observe more about it, naturally. And things get less clear as they get further away, and we can't observe the details. We see the overall forms. We see the forests rather than the trees. We see mountains rather than the forests. And then, way beyond, we see just a general vista of blue, black, and white. Well, in my example, the amount of detail tapering off from foreground to background is very natural. As illustrators, we can control the level of detail in our images, especially when aiming to distinguish foreground from background. Even in a flat style, you can show that something is in the foreground by increasing its size and the level of detail, and similarly that something is in the background by decreasing relative sizes and especially the level of detail. I used to think that it was important that I added careful, thoughtful details to every single object in my illustrations. I thought that added value to my creations. But what it ended up doing was making the hierarchy less clear. It muddied up the image. It gave my work an overworked feeling. How come, I would wonder, when I look at others' illustrations, they seem to be so clear and confident? Why did mine always look so tortured and busy? It turns out a huge reason was that I was paying too much attention to details that didn't matter to the main idea of the image. I was getting carried away. When trying to resolve an illustration that seems to have a busy or cluttered feeling to it, I would say that you should try distinguishing what should be in the foreground and background respectively, and keep these two on separate planes as much as possible. The way you can do this is by simply making your main subject in the foreground more detailed and more meticulous or clear in its construction, and then being more notional with the background elements. Maybe the foreground or the main subject is in color with solid shapes, and then the background is just lines in one lighter color, for instance. I do this in my work very often. Now, if you don't want just lines in your background, if you want to have a more full, solid, if you want to use fuller, solid colors and shapes back there in the background as well, you can just go easy on the level of detail that you put in the background. Things in the foreground can be more detailed with subtleties, while things in the background can be less detailed and lack the same level of definition. The main idea here is to imitate the natural way things that are closest to us are more detailed, and the things that are further away are less detailed and more general. You can use this principle literally when composing scenes, or you can do so more metaphorically when trying to arrange primary, secondary, and tertiary objects into a single image to communicate a single idea. And that's something I really want to clarify that one point, where I'm talking about a scene with a literal foreground, a literal background. But sometimes if it's more of a conceptual illustration, there's no foreground and background, but there's maybe a symbolic foreground, the thing that needs to stand out and come forward. Give that thing more detail. And then the things that support it, that's the metaphorical background, and go easy on the details on that part. Okay, so the final principle for composition today is what I'll call flow. Again, this comes down to hierarchy. Your eyes are going to flow from the main thing to the next thing, and then to the next thing in the hierarchy, and so on. But there's more to flow than just the kind of basic order of importance we talked about in hierarchy. Flow is more about wayfinding. It's the path your eyes are supposed to take. Hierarchy plays an important part in how you flow through an image, but sometimes it needs a little help. Hierarchy is important in how your eyes flow through an image, but sometimes it needs a little help. That's where flow comes in. Flow is like putting directional arrows in the image that tell your eyes where to look next, but not necessarily in such an obvious way. When you go to the airport, you're constantly being guided to the next important place by wayfinding signs. When you're driving, the signs on the highway tell you how to get to the airport. When you get closer, the signs tell you which road leads to which terminal. When you get to the terminal, you're given directions to the departures and arrivals. When you get dropped off at departures, because that's where you want to go, you are then guided to the airline-specific kiosks, and then ultimately you'll get to the gate where you'll wait for a long time and flip between checking your phone and passively watching CNN on one of the many available overhead screens. But more to my point, you got to the gate without having to think too hard because all the directional signs were there showing you the way. While the actual route you took may have been very roundabout and zigzaggy, it hopefully felt like a linear experience thanks to the great work of whomever designed the wayfinding system at the airport. Flow in an illustration is a little bit like that. There should be a purposeful direction into the piece, and if needs be, out of it as well. In my quick research for today's video, I came across an article called How to Draw Composition and Planning Drawings. I'll leave a link to it in the description. The gist of it is that it gives you these 4 compositional types: S composition, O composition, U composition, and L composition. You know, these are pretty straightforward. These are descriptions of the flow line through an illustration. With the S, you come in from one end, you go over to the other, then swoop down and back to the first side, and then back out the other way, somewhere near the bottom, let's say. You know, I have yet to determine whether these are helpful or not. I don't think there are just 4 shapes you should follow in your illustration. Where I'm at right now is that I actually believe that you can probably just throw out this idea, different shapes of flow, because if you're like me, you'll probably worry about which composition type you should choose, and then once you choose something, you then start worrying about whether you're, following in that particular shape in exactly the right way. And I'm here to help you, and I'm here to make your decisions easier and not harder. So with no disrespect to the author of the Soul Method, I say nuts to that. Rather, simply think about the flow of your composition in this way. Make sure no part of the image gets forgotten. I'll say that again. Make sure no part of the image gets forgotten. When you're filling whatever space you need to fill with your art, consider that every square centimeter matters. Even if it's like a 5th level supporting element way down in the hierarchy, if it's in the image, it's there for a reason. It doesn't necessarily need to be noticed, but it's supporting something that is supporting something that's supporting something that does need to be noticed. But more to my point, make sure objects communicate with one another in the image. In fact, I might have called this principle communication instead. You might have a very busy illustration or a very simple one, but the main objects in your composition should communicate with one another. If it's one main character and 2 others, maybe those 2 are both looking at the main character. If it's 2 characters and an object, maybe one is looking at the object and the other is looking at the first character, creating a sort of circular composition. One of the most classic examples of this kind of flow in an image is the Andrei Rublev icon Trinity. In this image, we have 3 angels representing the Holy Trinity, of course, and there seems to be an ever-flowing exchange between them, directed by their gazes, but also by their hand gestures and overall body directions. Note also how they frame the central goblet, which may or may not be the main subject of the image. You know, if well played, ambiguity and hierarchy can create a more compelling image. So sometimes the hierarchy can be purposefully unclear, but that's besides the point. In terms of composition, the goblet is also the hub of a wheel, and the 3 angels are kind of like the spokes. There's movement in the image because of how each element within it communicate with one another and create that motion. When approaching composition in my own work, I almost always aim to have one central idea that is most important, and I try to control how others experience this through intentionally manipulating hierarchy and the level of detail. But then flow is, of course, how about the eye flows through these things. What I don't want is for the eye to fall into a dead zone of the image or for it to fly off the page before it had a chance to get to see everything else in the page. That would be like being at the airport and having just gone through security, a misinformed sign tells you to turn left instead of right, and you end up exiting back to the pre-security check area, and then you have to go back and do it all over again. Hopefully this doesn't cause you to miss your flight, which is one of my recurring anxiety dreams, by the way. Anyway, hopefully these 3 principles, hierarchy, detail, and flow, or communication, help simplify some of your compositional struggles. There's so much more, I'm sure, but honestly, I feel like if we had fewer rules and just more of a sense of why these rules exist in the first place, we'd find ourselves more naturally applying them. Composition can be as complicated as you make it. You can nerd out about grids or attempt to make sense of the golden ratio as some sort of standard of compositional perfection, but as for me, I'd rather just tell a story or make a point with my images. You can do that through just these 3 principles, and everything else could just be for academic study or curiosity, in my opinion. In my upcoming class, it will be certainly interesting to look more closely at more traditionally upheld compositional principles and see them at play in various art throughout the ages. That's definitely on my to-do list, and who knows, maybe I'll be proven wrong about my simpler is better approach and we'll all be better for it. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. My name is Mr. Tom Froese. I'll see you in the next one.